We all know what role finances and money play in today's sporting world, and of course European football is no different. And there are only a few factors that can measure up to as much relevance and impact as making the Champions League versus missing out. The financial implications are franchise-altering, club trajectory-altering, and no club in the Premier League needs to make the Champions League this year more than Newcastle United. We're going to talk about why that is and if they can pull it off next, here at Pints and Punditry at the Pitchside Pub. So profit and sustainability rules have a lot of problems. They are far from perfect. There's a lack of transparency. We don't know how consistently they're enforced, but we cannot argue with the fact that they are regulating the game, and it means every dollar matters for every club. The money matters, the income matters, because even clubs with fantastically wealthy owners can only spend so much more than they bring in. So the revenue really is so important these days, but to certain clubs it is more important than others, and that's largely the clubs that have backed themselves into a corner financially through their own moves. They've spent a lot of money, and now they need European football competition in order to justify that spend or to continue spending it. Making the Champions League is worth 25 million euros a year minimum, and that's without even making a run and going in to the knockout phase and making more money. It can be upwards of 40 and 50 million euros per year, and that is a fantastic amount of money for some clubs that need every dollar of it. And when we look at the Premier League table, I'm going to argue that there is no club that needs it more this year than Newcastle United because of the way they have spent. So we're going to get into why that is and what they can do about it coming up here in a second. But before we do, go ahead and hit that subscribe button for me down below so you can follow the channel. Get down in the comment section. Do you think there's other clubs that need it more than them? I think Newcastle's the one that needs it the most, but get down in that comment section. Let me know your thoughts. You can also leave some comments and give us a follow on Blue Sky at Pitchside Pub, and check out the website pitchsidepub.com. Right, so we look at the Premier League table, right, and the money, every one of these clubs needs more money to spend. Everybody needs more money to spend, but not every one of them is in as precarious as a position when it comes to that PSR cliff. And again, we don't know exactly where that is, so it's really hard to gauge, especially from the outside, but we do know that Newcastle has been somewhere on the brink of the penalty zone, right? They have been examined further by the bodies at work that regulate these things, and they are certainly not able to spend the way they had. In fact, they have spent a lot over the past few years as they got their Saudi ownership and got a lot of money behind them, and they got back in the Premier League and they made the run that got them to the Champions League in the first place. They spent a ton of money. Look at these net spends from a few years back. The 21-22 season, it was over 130 million euros, 170 the following year, and 103 in 23-24, until last year they actually had to sell off some players and they had a negative net spend, and they have not been able to reinforce the roster the way they like. Now, spending that money, I'm not knocking spending it. Spending that money is how they got to the Champions League in the first place. That's how they got that top four finish, and they wanted to compete in the Champions League. So they spent a lot of money on the Sandro Tonali's and the Alexander Isaks and the Anthony Gordons of the world to give themselves a Champions League roster. So it's not that they shouldn't have spent it, but once they got to the Champions League, they needed depth, and they weren't able to reinforce that roster to compete on four fronts, as English clubs have to do when they are in Europe as well. And so they didn't have the depth to compete in so many areas. And now they don't have the money to reinforce it. And if you follow the transfer rumors, even the ones in the middle of the season this January, there are a lot of rumors for a lot of their players. Now, it does look like they're going to extend Alexander Isak and keep him at Newcastle, which is fantastic. He has become one of the two best strikers in the Premier League, along with Erling Haaland. They are both having fantastic seasons, and he is a key guy that they cannot lose. But in order to keep him and give him a raise and give him an extension, they may have to sell some players off. Anthony Gordon is being rumored to be a possible sale, which would be devastating because he is beloved in Newcastle and he's a great player and he's part of their success. Bruno Guimaraes is connected with Manchester City, who have shown a lot of interest in him, and he's the catalyst. He's the holding midfielder that is the defensive stalwart that can get forward, and he's just such a valuable player. And so, you don't want to have to dismantle this roster, particularly as they make another run to get back into a Champions League spot. And if you look at the table, the Premier League table right now, I personally believe that they are the club that needs the Champions League money the most. Look at the table right now. Liverpool, Arsenal are probably going to make it, so they're not really on the cusp of things, and probably could function even without that money for a year or so, although maybe they'd have to sell a piece or something if they're on the cusp. Arsenal's done a lot of spending lately, but they probably are not at risk of missing it, so they're not really part of the conversation. Clubs like Nottingham Forest, Bournemouth knocking on the door, they're a few spots out, but those clubs probably have, budgeted not planning on that money, right? Nottingham Forest has spent a fair amount of money over the past couple of years as they got back to the Premier League, and they had some PSR reviews as well, but they are probably not banking on Champions League money, and that's part of what it comes down to is the clubs that spend assuming they are going to get some sort of European money, really put themselves in a position where they have to then get that money, and if they don't, they have a real problem on their hands. Nottingham Forest is probably not one of those clubs. Even the most optimistic Nottingham Forest fan probably would have said, okay, maybe we could sneak into like a Conference League spot, but would they really say, oh yeah, we knew we were going to get this Champions League money, so we went out and spent? No one's saying that. So while they would love that money, it would help them reinforce, and again, every dollar matters to every club, they're probably not banking on it, right? They are in a position, along with your Bournemouths and your Fulhams and some of those mid-table clubs, or traditionally mid-table clubs, they're in a position where if they don't get that European money, they're still able to survive because they weren't counting on it anyway. Then you have clubs like Chelsea, Manchester United, the bigger clubs that are spending a ton but haven't had the European money for a while. Chelsea's getting the Conference League money right now, but given what they've spent, that's really a drop in the bucket. Chelsea, with all of their ridiculous spending over the past couple of years, has managed to spread the payments out over 7, 8, 9 years in some cases so that they are PSR compliant. So they've managed to function without it. Manchester United hasn't had Champions League money in a few years. They're getting Europa League money right now, but they've managed to function without it, even with their massive payroll. So while it matters, and another 40, 50 million influx would allow them a lot of flexibility as they try to rebuild the roster for Ruben Amorim, they've learned to function without it. They've got a lot of assets they can sell off, assets that they don't really want anyway because they don't fit in Amorim's system. So again, they can function without that money, but which clubs can't function without it? Look at the table again. Manchester City, probably okay. They've got enough money and their net spend has been low up until this January, so they can continue to spend even if they were to miss out. But if you look at Newcastle, they are probably the club. Maybe you could argue Villa up until the John Duran sale. Now they just cashed in with a massive sale selling John Duran to Saudi Arabia, so they're covered for a while. That gives them a ton of financial flexibility to go spend some more money without, even if they don't make the Champions League. But Newcastle really needs to make the Champions League to be able to reinvest and not even bolster their roster at this point, but just to be able to hold on to the players they have. There was a report that came out there. Their match day revenue in the year where they went to the Champions League was 51.7% higher than it was in the previous year. That's a massive, massive difference. Their match day revenue. A lot of that came from Champions League, from hosting Champions League games. Some of that was raising ticket prices, and there's controversy there. But that's the sort of revenue that comes in, and that's not even the money you actually get for making the Champions League. So there's so much money at stake here if you make the European competitions that really can make or break a club. So if they're going to extend Isak and they're going to continue to be a top 10 payroll club, they really need this money just to keep their roster intact, let alone add any reinforcements. Now, you could look at them and say, okay, should they sell one of their more valuable assets off to then turn it into 3 or 4 different players to bolster the roster? If they did that from a tactical standpoint, okay, that's an argument you could make. Maybe Sandro Tonali has regained enough of his value that they could sell him. Selling Guimaraes would be really tough. Obviously, it's not going to be Isak. Anthony Gordon would be a wildly unpopular move to sell him. So who is it that they're selling where they can still maintain the level of play that they've had, because they are playing good ball right now, and there is a good chance that they sneak into that 4th spot. It's going to be between them, City, Nottingham Forest, if they can hold on to the level of play that they've been at, but there's some question marks there. I think Newcastle needs it more than any of the other clubs. The dollars matter to everybody, but I think in this case, in the situation we're at right now at the end of January in 2025, I think these dollars, the Champions League dollars, even the Champions League dollars versus the Europa League dollars, which is a minimum of 20 million difference and possibly more if you make deep runs, that could be the difference between holding on to a key player or feeling like they have to sell for next year, so that even if they were to make it, they don't have the roster that they need. So I think the Champions League spot matters more to Newcastle than any other club in the Premier League, but I'd love to get your thoughts. Get down in the comments section. Let me know what you think. Does it make sense what I'm saying here, that it matters to them? The dollars, every dollar matters more to Newcastle, or are there other clubs where it matters more? I think Villa's the only one you could have made that argument, but now that they sold John Duran, they are flush with cash, and I think that takes them out of the running there. It seems like it's Newcastle to me, but get down in that comment section. Let me know what you think. You can also leave some comments on Blue Sky at Pitchside Pub. Make sure you hit that subscribe button for me down below if you don't already follow the channel, and check out the website, pitchsidepub.com. Thanks as always for joining us here on Pints and Punditry at the Pitchside Pub.